Everyone said I should have just ignored it. But tell me, how do you ignore someone demanding $350,000 for land you already own? How do you brush off a piece of paper that feels heavier than stone, with words sharp enough to cut through everything you thought you knew about your family's legacy? That morning, I was standing at the fence line my grandfather and I had painted only a few months before. The air still held that sharp cedar scent, the kind that sticks in your chest and makes you feel grounded. But that grounding didn't last long. Because down my private ranch road came a black Mercedes, moving slow, like it owned the gravel under its wheels. The driver's window slid down with an almost theatrical hum. Out stepped Vivian Hale, perfect hair, tailored suit, heels that somehow didn't sink into the dirt. She looked like she'd stepped out of a real estate brochure, the kind where they sell you houses with words like luxury and exclusive. But her eyes, they were wrong. Too polished. Too rehearsed. Like she was about to sell me something she knew was broken. She introduced herself as the CFO of the company that helped manage the Willowbrook Estates HOA, the subdivision bordering my ranch. She held out a certified envelope like it was scripture. When I didn't immediately take it, she pressed it into my chest. The paper crinkled against me, but her grip stayed iron-tight until I pulled it free. I opened it right there, letting her watch. My gut told me not to wait, not to give her that satisfaction. The number jumped out first, $350,000, due in 30 days, daily interest if late. My laugh came out sharp, too loud in the quiet of the ranch. But then my eyes fell lower to the tiny footnote hidden at the bottom of the page. A clause, dressed in legal jargon, but glowing red in my mind like a warning flare. By paying, I'd agree to indemnify the HOA forever, against boundary claims, easement disputes, or title issues. Forever. I looked up at her, the paper shaking slightly in my hands, not from the wind, but from the weight of what it implied. "What kind of improvements cost this much?" I asked. Her smile was too fast, too ready. She launched into a memorized spiel about shared watershed management and emergency access routes. Big words, meant to distract, but I'd been watching Willowbrook's construction for years. I'd seen them finish their shiny new community center just last summer. They weren't hurting for roads or water. Something was off. And in that moment, my grandfather's words came back to me like he was whispering from the grave. Land doesn't lie, paperwork does. I spent the rest of that day in my home office, fingers flying over the keyboard, pulling up county GIS maps. Old plat records lit up my dual screens, and there it was, the first breadcrumb. A notation, RA 74, dated 1974. My pulse kicked harder as I followed it. A master ground lease, 50 years. I did the math, 1974 plus 50, that's 2024. My hands froze on the desk. We were in October of 2024. My grandfather had never mentioned it, not once, but I couldn't shake the feeling he'd known, that maybe he left this for me to find. Hours blurred into minutes as I combed through deed records, cross-checking plat maps with property lines. The more I dug, the clearer it became. Willowbrook's developer never bought the land outright. They'd leased it from my grandfather, 50 years, and the option to buy, it had expired last December. Which meant, when the clock struck midnight on New Year's Eve, all of Willowbrook, the houses, the parks, the streets, legally reverted to my ranch. I pushed my chair back, laughing in disbelief. Families were living in homes that might not even belong to them, and the HOA, they knew. That's why they wanted me to sign. They weren't billing me for improvements. They were trying to trick me into waiving rights I didn't even know I had. I stepped outside, drone in hand, launching it into the dusk sky. On my screen, the red overlay of the old plat swallowed everything, the subdivision, the tennis courts, the swimming pool, even their precious guardhouse. All of it was mine, or soon would be. The drone hovered silent, my breath was. Because the truth had just landed like a hammer. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about an entire neighborhood standing on borrowed ground. And I was holding the deed to their future. Have you ever held a truth so heavy, it felt like it might crush you before you could even speak it aloud? That's exactly what it felt like, staring at that drone screen as the red boundary swallowed Willowbrook whole. Families were eating dinner, kids playing on sidewalks, while overhead their entire neighborhood glowed inside the lines of my family's ranch. And the sickest part, they had no idea. The next morning my phone rang. Unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Mr. Carter, the voice was too cheerful, too smooth. Franklin Moore, the HOA president. I recognized him instantly from the neighborhood meetings I'd sat in on, the kind where you promise not to roll your eyes while men in polos argue about lawn heights. His tone carried that salesman slickness, the kind that makes you want to check your wallet after hanging up. He invited me to the HOA office, said there'd been a miscommunication about the assessment, and that we could work out a mutually beneficial arrangement. My gut twisted, the same gut that told me Vivian's letter wasn't just an invoice, it was bait. I agreed, but before leaving, I slipped a small recorder into my jacket pocket. If they wanted to play games, I'd make sure every word was saved. The HOA office looked more like a staged house than a business. Beige siding, burgundy trim, fake colonial columns like a cheap costume pretending to be important. Franklin greeted me at the door, his handshake lingering too long, his eyes darting like he was trying to measure how much I knew. Inside, Vivian sat waiting with a stack of papers thick enough to be a phone book. A tray of pastries and coffee sat on the table, hospitality disguising a trap. I stuck with water. Franklin launched into his speech, throwing out words like synergy, stakeholder value, community partnership. I nearly laughed. It sounded like he'd swallowed a corporate dictionary. Vivian nodded along, like a metronome set to corporate nonsense. Then he slid a document toward me. The title read, Mutual Infrastructure Cooperation Agreement. I read slowly, carefully, legal jargon designed to dull the senses, paragraphs about maintenance, drainage, cost-sharing. It was enough to make most people glaze over, but I kept reading and there it was, page 7. A single clause, buried like a landmine. By signing, I'd acknowledge the HOA's ownership interest in any disputed boundary areas and indemnify them against claims. My throat tightened. This was the same poison, just dressed in prettier language. They weren't fixing a miscommunication, they were rewriting history, hoping I'd sign away land they knew wasn't theirs. I set the paper down. Interesting clause, I said, my voice calm. Franklin's smile cracked just for a second before snapping back into place. Boilerplate, he said quickly. Standard stuff, nothing to worry about. But when I leaned in and asked directly about RA 74, the ground lease from 1974, the room froze. Vivian's pen halted mid-stroke. Franklin's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. Silence stretched, broken only by the tick of the cheap wall clock. Then Franklin's mask slipped. His voice dropped low, almost threatening. He told me if I didn't sign today, they'd file an encroachment complaint, notify my insurance, call my mortgage lender, they'd bury me in problems until I caved. But here's what he didn't know. I didn't have a mortgage. The ranch was mine, free and clear. And my insurance company, they'd be thrilled to learn about potential title defects, because it meant they could walk away from coverage. I stood, checking my phone like I was late for something. That's when I caught it, a whisper. Vivian leaned toward Franklin, her voice barely audible, but my recorder picked it up later. Prepare the boundary package, version 2. My heart thudded. Version 2, that meant there was a version 1. Multiple sets of documents hidden away, altered, forged. My instincts screamed yes. I left the office without another word. Franklin called after me, trying to soften his tone, but the damage was done. They'd shown their hand. I didn't go home. I drove straight to the county recorder's office, the one place that never lies. Sarah, the clerk, still remembered me from my surveyor days. She didn't even blink when I asked for the original RA 74 plat, the one Vivian had just confirmed existed in versions. She disappeared into the back and came out with a manila folder that smelled like dust and history. Inside was the original hand-drawn plat, beautiful in its precision. Every line, every boundary, every amendment scribbled in the margins by men who thought in decades, not months. And there it was, the note that would change everything. A denial of purchase option, dated last December. The HOA had tried to exercise it, but failed. Water rights unmet, extension denied, lease expired. I snapped photos, got certified copies, logged every seal. Sarah stamped them with the kind of care you only see when someone knows history is being recorded. Walking out with that folder tucked under my arm, I felt it in my bones. I wasn't holding paper. I was holding the detonator. Everyone talks about holding power like it's exciting. But the truth, real power feels terrifying. It sits heavy in your hands, whispering consequences you're not sure you can carry. That's exactly what it felt like driving away from the recorder's office, that manila folder riding shotgun like a live explosive. By the time I pulled into Walter Briggs' driveway, my knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Walter wasn't just any attorney, he'd been the county's go-to property lawyer for decades, the kind of man who knew every plat and deed like they were chapters in his own family Bible. When I called him earlier and mentioned RA 74, he paused for a long time before saying only, "Grant, you'd better come see this in person." His office felt like a courtroom frozen in amber. Stacks of leather-bound law books lined the walls. The air smelled of lemon polish and paper older than me. Walter adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses as he flipped open a notary logbook that looked fragile enough to crumble. "Your grandfather was smart," he said, running his finger down a page dated November 1973. "Smarter than most men I knew." He tapped a red asterisk. The entry, Master Ground Lease, RA 74. But it wasn't just the entry that stopped me cold, it was the tiny notations scrawled in colored inks across the margin. Blue from 1984, boundary adjustment, never completed. Green from 1991, mineral rights reserved to the landowner. And then the one that made my blood freeze, red ink, dated December 20th of last year. Extension request denied, water resource conditions not met, Regulation 774.3. Walter leaned back, studying me over the tops of his glasses. The option to purchase lapsed grant. They tried to exercise it, but the state shut them down 11 days before the deadline. They've been squatting ever since. My chest tightened. They knew. The HOA board, Vivian Franklin, they'd known their option expired. And instead of telling their neighbors, instead of being honest with 300 families, they tried to bury me in fraudulent assessments. Walter wasn't finished. He pulled another document from a folder thick with county stamps. A chain of title, written like a family tree of the land. Each deed, each lien, each easement documented in clean, unbroken order. My grandfather's ranch sat at the root. And then Walter pointed to something almost too simple to believe. Taxes. "For 50 years, he said, tapping the yellowed receipts, your grandfather and now you paid the ad valorem taxes on the land itself, every acre. Meanwhile, the HOA only ever paid taxes on the improvements. Houses, streets, pools, they never paid land tax. Why? Because they didn't own it." He fired up an old calculator, the kind with the paper tape that clicked and whirred. The machine spat out line after line before he tore the strip free and handed it to me. "Half a century of taxes paid," he said quietly. "Proof they never had title, they built on leased land, Grant, and your family kept the ground solid beneath them." I swallowed hard. This wasn't just a legal technicality. This was fraud, layered over fraud, wrapped in deception. Walter rose, pulling a magnifying glass from his desk. He held it over the county seal on the original lease. "You need to see this." Through the glass, I saw faint microprinting along the seal's edge. Patterns the county changed every 5 years back then to prevent counterfeiting. "Spring batch 1974, Walter confirmed. "Authentic, original, not a copy, not forged, the real deal." He slid one last paper across the desk, the original purchase option terms, and when I read them, my jaw clenched. Purchaser must secure independent water rights sufficient for 75% of planned development capacity, verified by the State Water Board, prior to the deadline. Walter pulled another sheet from a neat file, a denial letter, dated December 18th last year. Bold red ink at the top, DENIED, insufficient water rights. Development remains dependent on senior ranch rights, established 1892. My ranch. They failed officially, permanently. Walter removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly like every word he spoke had to be weighed. Your grandfather left you this fight for a reason. He could have ended it years ago, but he didn't. He let them build, let families move in, but he also made sure the lease was ironclad, and now the clock has run out. The room felt suffocating. For 50 years, families believed they owned their homes, but in reality, they'd been tenants on borrowed dirt. What should I do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Walter put his glasses back on and met my eyes, steady and firm. Find a way to punish the guilty without destroying the innocent. The land is yours. The question is, what kind of man are you going to be with it? I left his office carrying not just certified documents, but a burden my grandfather had kept silent his whole life. Out in the cold night air, I realized something. This wasn't just about land. This was about justice. Sometimes the truth doesn't come crashing down like thunder. Sometimes it leaks through the cracks like water, silent but unstoppable. That's how it began unraveling. One man, one folder, and a conscience he couldn't silence anymore. I found Rowan Blake in the record's annex basement. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across rows of dusty boxes stacked to the ceiling. The air smelled like mildew and old paper. He stood at a metal table, his shoulders squared, a folder in front of him like it was a weapon. He didn't say hello, didn't shake my hand, just slid the folder across the table. "Grant," he said, voice low and steady. "I was treasurer for 3 years, I know where the bodies are buried, and I'm done keeping quiet." I opened the folder, half expecting nothing but old bills. What I saw instead made my stomach lurch. Utility maps dated, certified, stamped. Each year laid out like a timeline of lies. Rowan tapped the first map. 2018, his finger slid to the next. 2019, another. 2020. Then he tapped the last one, marked only weeks earlier. At first glance, they looked identical, but then I saw it. The pump station had moved, on paper. The infrastructure didn't move, Rowan explained, his voice taut with anger. The maps did. They redrew the lines to make it look like everything sits on HOA land. But I was there when we installed those systems back in '98. That pump station sits smack in the middle of your grandfather's master parcel. We even had to beg him for temporary easements just to finish construction. The realization hit like a hammer to the chest. Not only had they built on leased land, they'd been quietly altering maps to cover their tracks. Rowan reached into his folder again and pulled out another stack, this one marked with red tabs. "Board meeting minutes," he said. "The real ones, not the sanitized versions online." The pages reeked of corruption. Scribbled notes in margins, references to risk management, and one entry dated August 10th that sent chills through me. Vivian's nephew had run a title search. They knew. They'd known for months the lease was expiring and the option had lapsed. Instead of telling homeowners, they'd schemed to trap me with assessments and indemnity clauses before I figured it out. Rowan's jaw tightened. They used words like risky but necessary. That's not leadership. That's survival instinct dressed up in a suit. Before I could respond, footsteps echoed down the concrete stairwell. Rowan's face paled. We weren't alone. Vivian's nephew, Thomas, appeared in the doorway, phone raised like a weapon, already recording. His voice was sharp, demanding, "What's going on here?" He aimed the camera square at us, smugness plastered across his face like armor. But Rowan didn't flinch. To my surprise, he stepped forward, his voice steady and clear. "My name is Rowan Blake," he declared into the phone. "Former treasurer of Willowbrook Estates HOA. I am providing evidence of financial irregularities and intentional misrepresentation by current board members. This is a protected whistleblower action under Statute 43.5. Thomas blinked, thrown off. He hadn't expected defiance. Rowan kept going. The board knew about the lease expiration. They hid it from homeowners, and they attempted to extort $350,000 from Grant Carter through fraudulent assessments. Thomas shifted, sweat beading at his temple. He turned the phone toward me, desperate to regain control. "You're interfering in HOA business, Carter. That's illegal." I pulled out my own phone and hit record. "Actually, Thomas, what's illegal is recording people in a government building without their consent. Felony, also illegal, witness intimidation, which is exactly what you're doing right now." His confidence cracked. His phone lowered an inch. His voice trembled. "My aunt's lawyers will destroy you both." "Maybe," I said quietly, "but at least we'll go down telling the truth. Can you say the same?" The silence stretched, heavy enough to smother. Finally, Thomas turned and stormed up the stairs, his footsteps fading fast. Rowan exhaled shakily, then slid one last document across the table. His hands trembled now, not with fear but with anger. "This came yesterday," he said. It was an indemnity letter, Vivian's handwriting, her signature stamped at the bottom. It demanded all current and former board members sign, accepting personal liability for any lawsuits related to the land issue. HOA insurance wouldn't cover them. "She's throwing us all under the bus," Rowan whispered, voice breaking. "Her own insurance will save her, but the rest of us will lose everything." Betrayal dripped from every word. And in that moment, I made my decision. "Rowan, I'm filing a lease pendens this afternoon. Every property transaction in Willowbrook gets frozen until this is resolved." Rowan nodded slowly, like a man watching the final match fall onto a pile of dry kindling. "Then it's over," he said. "Their lies, their schemes frozen mid-stride." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt control. Some decisions feel like pulling a trigger. That's what it felt like, walking into the county recorder's office with that stack of certified documents in my hand. Filing the lease pendens wasn't just a legal move, it was dropping a bomb in slow motion. The clerk stamped it at exactly 4:22 p.m. The sound echoed louder than it should have, like a gavel sealing someone's fate. I asked for 5 certified copies. She glanced at the description on the paperwork and raised her eyebrows. "That's all of Willowbrook Estates, isn't it?" I just nodded. Word spread faster than wildfire. By morning, every real estate agent in 3 counties knew. Property sales froze instantly. Banks panicked. Title companies shut down deals mid-signature. 300 families woke up trapped in houses they suddenly couldn't sell, refinance, or insure. My phone buzzed nonstop. Calls from unknown numbers. Voicemails filled with threats and pleading voices. And then came the text. A photo of my truck parked at the record's annex, time-stamped from earlier that day. Beneath it, "You're making enemies you can't afford." Enemies I couldn't afford, maybe, but enemies who couldn't afford to lose this fight, absolutely. By nightfall, another message arrived, this one from Vivian herself. "We need to meet, tomorrow, no lawyers." I texted back one line, "County courthouse, public meeting room, bring whoever you want." Because at this point, privacy was her weapon. Publicity would be mine. The next morning, the courthouse hearing room was packed, standing room only. Residents filled the gallery, whispering nervously. These weren't just homeowners anymore. They were potential squatters on land they didn't own. Franklin sat at the applicant's table looking haggard, his tie loose, eyes ringed with exhaustion. Vivian, by contrast, looked like an ice statue, polished, unyielding, as if she could will herself into control through sheer posture. But I saw the tremor in her hand as she arranged her papers. When the hearing officer called us to order, silence fell so heavy it pressed against the walls. Franklin spoke first, trying to spin the crisis as a misunderstanding. He talked about good faith negotiations, community expectations, established precedent. But when asked to produce a single deed proving ownership, nothing, just empty air. The officer's brow furrowed. Even he looked tired of the word games. Then it was my turn. I stood, laying out the evidence piece by piece like a surgeon exposing the truth with steady hands. The original plat, the lease terms, the failed purchase option, the water rights denial. Each document stacked higher, heavier, until the table itself seemed to bow under the weight of their lies. The room stayed silent, broken only by gasps when I revealed something damning. Parents clutched each other's hands. A man in the back shook his head in disbelief. The truth wasn't dramatic, it was inevitable. Then came the title insurance representative, called to testify. She adjusted her glasses nervously, cleared her throat, and read from a prepared statement. After reviewing the provided documentation, our company must issue a reservation of rights notice. We cannot and will not provide coverage for any claims related to Willowbrook estate's property boundaries, until a clear chain of title is established. Effective immediately. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Without title insurance, nobody could buy, sell, or refinance. Willowbrook was officially frozen in time. That's when Vivian rose, slow and deliberate, pulling a single sheet from her briefcase with theatrical precision. "This quitclaim deed," she announced, her voice sharp as a knife, "transfers all rights from the Carter estate to the HOA. Dated 1998. Signed, sealed." For a second my stomach lurched. Had I missed something? I leaned closer, my eyes scanning, and then relief washed through me. The signature line was wrong. The notary seal came from a county my grandfather never did business in, and worst of all for her, the date was 3 years after he'd already placed the ranch in an irrevocable trust. He couldn't have signed it even if he'd wanted to. Her hands shook just slightly as I pointed out the flaws. The room buzzed with whispers. Then from the gallery, a new voice cut through the noise. A middle-aged woman with gray streaks in her hair stood up. She introduced herself as a bank employee, and her words landed like a hammer. "I personally audited the HOA's safe deposit box last September. That document she's holding wasn't there. But I saw Ms. Hale access the box last week, with a portable scanner. That paper is new." The room erupted. Shouts, gasps, accusations. The hearing officer banged his gavel 3 times, struggling to restore order. Vivian's mask cracked. Her composure shattered like glass under pressure. For the first time, the entire community saw her for what she was. Not a leader. Not a protector. A fraud. And that's when I knew, this wasn't just my fight anymore. The crowd wanted blood. They say silence can be louder than shouting. That courtroom silence, after the bank employee exposed Vivian's forgery, was deafening. 300 people leaned forward at once, as if waiting for someone to breathe so they could breathe too. I rose slowly, laying my hand on the stack of documents in front of me. My voice was steady, but inside my heart pounded like a war drum. "I'm willing," I said, each word deliberate, "to offer Willowbrook a new master ground lease. 30 years with renewal options. $5 per household per month for 6 months. Then $60 per year after that. Every home gets a permanent easement for its footprint and driveways. The HOA keeps managing the community. But the land rights will be clear." Gasps, whispers, a ripple of disbelief. To the homeowners, it was salvation. To Vivian and Franklin, it was surrender dressed as mercy. An elderly woman near the front whispered loudly enough for the room to hear, $5 a month. That's nothing. Why are they even fighting this?" Another voice hissed back, "Because someone's been lying to us for years." The hearing officer leaned forward, his gavel resting in his hand. "You've had notice since October. You've had your chance to prove ownership. Mr. Carter's proposal stands. I will recommend the county commission accept it subject to a membership vote, not just the board." Vivian shot to her feet, her face pale but her voice dripping with ice. "We need more time. This is unreasonable." But the officer shook his head. "You've had time. What you haven't had is honesty. And that quitclaim deed, I'm referring it to the district attorney for possible forgery and fraud." The room erupted again, this time with anger aimed squarely at her. Franklin sagged in his chair, his face gray with defeat. The next morning, the knock came at 7 a.m. A sheriff's deputy, envelope in hand, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Order to show cause," he said simply, handing it to me. I tore it open on the porch, the crisp morning air cutting my lungs. The judge had moved faster than anyone expected, probably because 300 homeowners had spent the night lighting up their representatives' phones, demanding answers. The order was brutal in its simplicity. The HOA had 72 hours to produce a valid chain of title from my grandfather to them, or accept my lease proposal exactly as presented. No changes, no stalling, no lies. I read it twice, my hands tightening around the paper. This was it. Their bluff was over. That afternoon, Nathan Reed, my attorney, spread the documents across his desk like a general laying out a battle map. His office smelled of coffee and old books, the kind of place where real work gets done. "This is better than we hoped," he said, scanning the order again. "They can't produce what doesn't exist, and the judge specifically said no wiggle room. They're boxed in, Grant, completely." But Nathan wasn't done. He pushed two new filings across the desk, his smile widening. First, the title insurer. They've formally invoked their reservation of rights. Translation: every homeowner's policy is suspended until this is resolved. Second, the HOA's lender. They've issued a cure notice, 30 days to fix the title issue, or the entire $2.5 million credit line gets called. I blinked. They don't have that money. Exactly, Nathan said. They're circling the drain. And as if the noose wasn't already tight enough, the court appointed a special master that evening. A forensic accountant with a reputation for tearing open fraud cases like wrapping paper. Her first act: freezing all discretionary HOA spending. No more payments to Vivian's management company. Only utilities and insurance. The text came from Rowan just after dark. Vivian just had a meltdown in the parking lot, screaming about conspiracies. Security had to escort her out. Someone filmed it. For a moment, I just stared at the message, the glow of my phone casting shadows across the kitchen table. The mighty Vivian Hale, the woman who'd strutted onto my land with a $350,000 demand, reduced to a public spectacle. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Because power doesn't just slip quietly from hands like hers. It claws, it bites, it lashes out one last time. And I knew Vivian had one desperate play left. Sometimes victory doesn't come with cheers. It comes with silence, the kind that follows when people realize the ground under their feet was never theirs to stand on. That's what Willowbrook felt like in those 72 hours. Quiet streets, curtains drawn, families whispering in kitchens, wondering if their homes were safe, or if the rug had just been yanked out forever. The special master didn't waste time. She walked into the HOA's office like a surgeon entering an operating room, calm, precise, and deadly with her tools. Within hours, the accountant's team had boxed up computers, copied hard drives, and sealed filing cabinets. Every payment, every receipt, every transfer for the last 10 years was laid bare. Rowan called me that night. His voice shook, not with fear this time, but with vindication. "Grant, you won't believe this. Millions, they've siphoned millions out of the reserve fund, transfers to shell companies, management fees 5 times the market rate, Franklin's brother on fake contracts, and Vivian, she's been paying herself out of a landscaping line item. Landscaping, Grant, she doesn't even own a shovel." I pressed the phone harder against my ear, letting the words sink in. Millions. Stolen right from under the very people they claim to protect. The next day, it broke wide open. Homeowners filled the community center, shouting, demanding answers. The special master stood on stage, her report in hand, her voice crisp and unflinching. "There are material misrepresentations, embezzlement indicators, and violations of fiduciary duty. In my professional opinion, this board cannot continue to govern." Gasps, cries, and then something remarkable happened. One by one, neighbors who'd once feared speaking against Vivian began shouting her down. "You lied to us. Where's our money, Vivian? You tried to ruin him to hide your crimes." Vivian didn't flinch. Her face was carved in stone, her smile brittle. She stood, microphone in hand, and delivered her final act. "You think this is over?" Her voice sliced through the chaos. "You think one farmer with dusty papers gets to take down decades of development? No, this is racketeering. A coordinated attack on a lawful association. I've already filed a federal RICO action against Grant Carter, his lawyer, and every traitor who sided with him." The room froze. RICO, the word carried weight, the kind that makes ordinary people shiver. She laid the papers on the table with a flourish, as though her performance alone could rewrite reality. "We'll drag him through federal court for years. He'll drown in legal fees before he ever touches this land again." For a moment, even I felt the weight of it. RICO lawsuits weren't just lawsuits. They were labyrinths designed to bleed defendants dry, and she knew it. But then Nathan leaned over and whispered in my ear, calm as a man holding aces in a card game. She just walked into her own grave. Because here, what Vivian didn't realize, you can't file a racketeering case while standing knee-deep in your own. The very forensic audit she thought she could outrun was already establishing patterns of mail fraud, wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, all under her leadership. Nathan went public that afternoon. He called a press conference on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, homeowners crowded in like spectators at an execution. His voice rang out steady as he raised the audit report for all to see. This isn't a neighborhood dispute. This is systemic fraud. Millions diverted, families betrayed. And now, instead of taking responsibility, the HOA president files a frivolous RICO action to silence whistleblowers and bury the truth. But here's the reality. Every page of this audit screams one thing: criminal conspiracy. The crowd roared, reporters scribbled. Vivian, watching from across the street, stood stiff as a mannequin, her sunglasses unable to hide the fury burning beneath. Rowan texted me that night, half the board resigned. Franklin turned his phone off. Neighbors are talking about suing her personally. She's finished. But I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because people like Vivian don't just surrender. They cling to the last branch on the cliff, even as the ground gives way beneath them. And as I lay awake in the dark, I couldn't shake the thought. Her last move hadn't come yet. And when it did, it would be the most dangerous of all. Sometimes the darkest hour comes not at midnight, but right before the dawn. That's what it felt like the morning Vivian made her last move. The summons came on a Friday thick packet, hand-delivered by a U.S. Marshal. Inside, her RICO complaint stretched over 180 pages, dripping with accusations. Fraud, collusion, conspiracy. She named me Nathan, Rowan, even Walter, the old notary. She painted us as criminals running a land scheme to illegally seize Willowbrook. For a moment, the weight pressed down on me so hard I couldn't breathe. A federal lawsuit isn't just a fight, it's a war. The kind designed to break men financially, emotionally, spiritually. And Vivian knew it. But what she didn't know was that her house of cards had already collapsed before she played her final hand. That same day, the Special Master's forensic audit reached the district attorney's desk. By Monday morning, investigators marched into the HOA office with warrants in hand, computers seized, bank accounts frozen. Franklin's brother picked up on embezzlement charges, and Vivian, she was served with her own indictment: wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy. She stormed into the courthouse in a tailored suit, cameras flashing, her face a mask of defiance. "This is retaliation," she screamed to reporters. "I'm the victim here." But the cameras didn't buy it. Neither did the homeowners watching on their phones, their anger now turned to open disgust. Still, she wasn't finished. 2 days later, she called an emergency HOA meeting. Against her own lawyer's advice, she stood before a dwindling crowd of residents, clutching a microphone like a lifeline. "They're trying to steal your homes," she cried, voice cracking. "Grant Carter is a vulture. He's using the courts to rob us all. If you don't fight with me, you'll lose everything." But this time, the room didn't erupt in applause. It erupted in silence. People stood. Chairs scraped the floor. One by one, they walked out, leaving her shouting into an empty room. The video went viral by morning. "HOA Queen loses her kingdom," the headlines mocked. I should have felt triumphant, but standing on my porch that night, the crickets chirping in the dark, all I felt was weary. This wasn't victory, it was survival. Then came the twist. Nathan called me at dawn, his voice tight but trembling with something close to awe. "You need to hear this," he said, forwarding me a voicemail. It was Vivian, her voice stripped of all arrogance, barely a whisper. "I can't do this anymore. They turned on me. Everyone turned on me. Maybe I went too far, maybe Carter, maybe he was right all along." Hours later, news broke. She'd been found in her car at a rest stop off Highway 72, hands shaking as deputies opened the door. Not a fugitive, not a leader. Just a woman finally caught by the weight of her own lies. The DA offered her a deal, restitution in exchange for cooperation. She took it. And in doing so, she signed the final paper that mattered, her resignation as president of the HOA. By summer, Willowbrook voted in a new board. Ordinary neighbors this time, teachers, veterans, retirees. The lease I offered was signed, sealed, and recorded. Families had certainty again. Kids rode bikes down streets no longer haunted by fear. One afternoon, Rowan stopped by the ranch. He handed me a photo, an old black and white image of my grandfather, hammer in hand, standing beside the first fence post he ever drove into the soil. On the back, scrawled in fading ink, were the words, "Land lasts longer than liars." I stared at that picture for a long time, and I realized the fight hadn't just been about dirt or deeds or dollars. It had been about dignity, about standing your ground when the world tells you to kneel. As the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the ranch in gold, I felt at peace at last. Vivian thought she could bury me with lies, but in the end, she only buried herself. And maybe that's what justice really looks like, not the sound of gavel strikes, not even the roar of a crowd, but the quiet hum of a community, finally free from the shadow of one woman's greed. Because sometimes, karma doesn't knock. It moves in, takes its seat, and waits patiently until the debt comes due. Every HOA has a story on HOA headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.